Suez Crisis Coincidences. British and French forces were attacking Egypt at the Suez Canal, and the Soviet government told the US that they should have teamed up in a military operation to stop this. The Soviets also warned the British and French governments that they were considering non-nuclear rocket attacks on London and Paris if they didn't stop. That night, the North American Aerospace Defense Command received multiple messages showing that unidentified aircraft were flying over Turkey. 100 Soviet fighter planes were over Syria, a British bomber had been shot down over Syria, and that the Soviet fleet was moving through the Dardanelles, a passage that goes from Turkey to Europe. At that point, US forces believed these events could trigger a NATO nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. But luckily, nothing happened, because it was later revealed that the unidentified aircraft over Turkey were actually just a wedge of swans. The 100 Soviet fighter planes over Syria were just a routine Air Force escort for the president of Syria, who was returning from a visit to Moscow. The British bomber went down due to mechanical problems, and that the movement through the Dardanelles was a scheduled routine exercise. Greenland's Moonrise. The U.S. early warning radar at Thule in Greenland reported to the North American Aerospace Defense Command headquarters in Colorado Springs that they saw dozens of Soviet missiles launched against the United States. The NORAD went into maximum alert, but one factor raised some questions. The Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, was in New York at the time, so it wouldn't have made much sense for the Soviets to attack at that time. This probably saved the world, and it was later discovered that the radar was actually fooled by the Moonrise over Norway, with computers misinterpreting this as an all-out attack on the U.S. Goldsboro B-52 crash. An American B-52 Stratofortress carrying 2 Mark 39 nuclear bombs broke up in mid-air near Goldsboro, a city in North Carolina, dropping the nukes too. The first bomb's parachute failed, and the bomb broke apart on impact, while the second one suffered little damage on impact, but 5 of the bomb's 6 safety devices failed during the crash. A later expert evaluation reported that one simple dynamo technology low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe: Omaha's lost connections. The Strategic Air Command's headquarters in Omaha lost contact with the early warning radar in Thule in Greenland, and when they tried to call NORAD headquarters in Colorado to find out what the problem was, the line was dead. Now, it's important to state that the likelihood of communication problems with both locations at the same time was really low, and that the Strategic Air Command was responsible for USA's nuclear weapons like strategic bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles. At this point, the Strategic Air Command thought that an attack was happening, so their entire alert force was ordered to prepare for takeoff. Fortunately, a U.S. bomber was circling over Thule and made contact with the early warning radar in Thule. The alert was called off. U-2 flights into Soviet airspace. American Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance planes occasionally and unintentionally strayed from Alaska into Soviet airspace, but one time, that happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. The U-2 pilots were ordered not to fly within 100 miles of Soviet airspace just to be sure, but for some other reason, a U-2 pilot was ordered to fly another route over the North Pole. The Aurora prevented proper navigation, and the plane accidentally strayed over the Chukotsky Peninsula, which was Soviet airspace. So Soviet MiG interceptors took off with orders to shoot down the American U-2. The pilot contacted his U.S. command post, and he was ordered to fly back towards Alaska, but he ran out of fuel while he was still in Soviet airspace, so U.S. F-102A fighters were launched to escort him on his glide to Alaska, with orders to prevent the Soviet MiGs from entering U.S. airspace. But the scary part comes now. The U.S. interceptor aircraft were armed with nuclear missiles, and they could have used them at their own discretion. Luckily, none of the pilots decided to use them. The Bears Incident. It was around midnight, and the world was in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when a guard at the Duluth Sector Direction Center saw an unidentified figure climbing the security fence. At that time, United States military planners expected that sabotage operations might precede any nuclear first strike by the Soviet Union. The guard shot at the anonymous figure and automatically activated the sabotage alarm, which automatically set off sabotage alarms at all bases in the area. This led to a big problem, because at Volk Field in Wisconsin, the alarm was wrongly wired and the klaxon sounded, which ordered nuclear-armed F-106A interceptors to take off. The pilots themselves were previously informed that there would be no practice alert drills while they were in DEFCON 3, so they actually thought World War III had started and that they needed to use their nukes. When they noticed that there was an error, aircraft were already starting down the runway, so an officer in a car raced from the command center and successfully signaled the aircraft to stop before they took off, which would have caused World War III to start for real. The unidentified figure was a bear, B-59 and Cuban Missile Crisis. 2 days after the Bears incident, a Soviet B-59 submarine was surrounded by American destroyers near Cuba. This wasn't unusual, as many other Soviet vessels had this happen to them. But this time, the B-59 chose to go underwater to avoid detection, but also not becoming able to communicate with Moscow for many days. Once the Americans noticed that the submarine wasn't coming out, they started dropping practice depth charges to signal the Soviet B-59 to surface, but the Soviet crew thought these were real depth charges. So, with low batteries affecting the submarine's life support systems and unable to make contact with Moscow, the commander of B-59 feared that war had already begun. He ordered the use of a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo against the American fleet, and they all agreed, but one man refused, Vasily Arkhipov, who was the chief of staff. He convinced the captain to calm down, surface, and make contact with Moscow for new orders, effectively saving the world. In sensitive events like these, it's not uncommon that news sources report things in a different lens based on their political leaning and interests, as we can see it happening right now too. Thanks to services like Ground News, which is also today's sponsor, we can get a more broad look into the news, garnering information from a multitude of sources and getting an unbiased look. For example, we just learned that Trump's, Vance's, and Harris campaign people's phones were targeted by Chinese hackers, and we can see how much the headlines differ based on where the source is leaning politically. 222 sources reported on the topic, mostly coming from center-leaning ones, creating what Ground News calls a potential blind spot of critical analysis for people who typically consume left or right-leaning sources. As you can see, Ground News collects articles from across the political aisle to ensure readers have access to diverse perspectives on every story. In this article made by a right-leaning source, we see how it stated that there were claims about Kamala Harris emboldening these countries to prevent Trump's win, while this article made by a left-leaning source says that they attacked phones associated with Kamala Harris and only possibly Donald Trump. It's important to note, a news outlet's political lean doesn't guarantee similar views either. Here's a left-leaning source that does say that Trump's phone was targeted, and not just possibly. Ground News doesn't tell you what to think. They gather the world's news to help you come to your own independent conclusions. And with notable figures like Trump and Harris often being the target of these misinformation campaigns, following their news on their dedicated election pages can really help you avoid being manipulated by the news you see and the news you don't. I really think Ground News' mission aligns with what I aim to do here on my channel, so go to ground.news/TPE to stay informed with context you can't find anywhere else. Or scan my QR code for 50% off the same top-tier Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all their features. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Moorestown's training tape. It's the day after the Soviet B-59 incident. It was around 9 a.m. when radar operators from Moorestown in New Jersey reported to NORAD headquarters that a nuclear attack was underway and was expected to hit Tampa in Florida in about 2 minutes. This happened because a test tape simulating a missile launch from Cuba was being run at the Moorestown facility when an actual satellite had unexpectedly appeared over the horizon, confusing the operators. This could have been prevented by the overlapping radars that were usually used to confirm the appearance of missiles, but they weren't operative. Also, the radar operators had not been informed of the passage of the satellite as they should have been, because the facility that would normally provide that notice had been assigned to other work during the crisis. All of NORAD was alerted, but before any action was taken, NORAD learned that no detonations had occurred at the expected time. Okinawa's incident. On the same day as the Moorestown's training tape incident, according to a technician who served there, a mistaken order was issued by the American Kadena Air Base in Okinawa in Japan to launch all their nuclear missiles. A team responsible for 4 nuclear missiles reported that the order's codes were in order, but the local officer in charge did not trust the order, partly because only one of their 4 missiles was targeted on Russia, and he saw no logic why missiles would be launched against China too. Also, at that time, they were only at DEFCON 2. No missiles were launched. The French Thunderstorm. French Strategic Air Force's electrical transmissions were disrupted due to a thunderstorm, causing a wartime takeoff order to be displayed. The French Air Force launched a Mirage 4 bomber with an AN-11 atomic bomb, and when they noticed the error and tried to call the crew back by radio, they did not respond. Miraculously, when they reached their refueling zone, they were unable to find the supply plane, forcing them to abort their mission and turn back. Solar flare incident. A powerful solar flare interfered with multiple NORAD radars, including 3 ballistic missile early warning systems that were just upgraded and resumed working a week before. Since these systems were so new, the interference was initially interpreted as intentional jamming of the radars by the Soviets, and thus an act of war. A nuclear bomber counterstrike was nearly launched by the United States, and the Strategic Air Command had prepared to launch fighters before NORAD alerted them of the solar flare. B-52 crash near Thule. A fire broke out on an American B-52 bomber carrying nuclear weapons, and the crew had to eject to save their lives. There had been no time to communicate with the Strategic Air Command headquarters, and the pilotless plane flew over the Thule base before crashing on the ice 7 miles offshore. If the nuclear weapons would have detonated, communication methods would have given an indication consistent with a successful enemy nuclear attack on both the base and the B-52 bomber. It would hardly have been anticipated that the combination could have been caused by accident because the map of the routes for B-52 airborne flights approved by the president showed no flight near Thule, and the route had apparently been changed without informing the White House. So, if the nuclear bombs went off, the US would have probably thought that the Soviet Union nuked them. The highly explosive content of the nuclear weapons exploded, but luckily there was no nuclear detonation. Lockheed EC-121 warning star. A United States early warning aircraft was shot down by a North Korean MiG-21 fighter, killing all 31 servicemen aboard. American F-4 Phantom fighter bomber jets at Kunsan Air Base in South Korea were ordered to load B-61 nuclear bombs and began preparations for a nuclear strike against North Korea. Reportedly, President Richard Nixon was drunk when he gave the order for a nuclear attack against North Korea, but an order to stand down was given on the advice of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Yom Kippur War. During the Yom Kippur War between Israel and the Arabic coalition, led by Egypt and Syria, U.S. intelligence reports and other sources suggested that the Soviet Union was planning to intervene to protect the Egyptians, and since President Richard Nixon was in the midst of his Watergate scandal and not available for a conference, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and other U.S. officials ordered DEFCON 3. It's thought that this was done to warn the Soviet Union to not intervene and not to actually prepare for war. But when mechanics were repairing one of the claxons at Kinchel Air Force Base in Michigan, they accidentally activated the whole base alarm system. B-52 crews rushed to their aircraft and started the engines, but luckily, the duty officer recognized the alarm was false in time and recalled the crews before any took off. Large-scale nuclear attack tape. At 8:50 a.m., American duty officers from NORAD, Strategic Air Command, the Pentagon National Military Command Center, and the Alternate National Military Command Center all saw on their displays a pattern that showed a large number of missiles as a full-scale attack from the Soviet Union. They immediately started preparations for retaliation, which lasted 6 minutes, and a number of Air Force planes were launched, including the President's National Emergency Airborne Command Post, which is the plane designed to allow the U.S. President to maintain control in case of an attack, even though the President wasn't on it. He had not yet been informed, probably because they couldn't find him. No attempt was made to use the hotline either to see the Soviets' intentions or to tell the Soviets the reasons for what was about to happen. With an incredible speed, NORAD was able to contact PAVPAW's early warning radar and learn that there were no missiles. In only 6 minutes, the threat assessment conference was terminated, and it was later discovered that the false alarm was caused by a technician who had mistakenly inserted a training tape containing a scenario for a large-scale nuclear attack into an operational computer. Senator Charles Percy was present at the NORAD headquarters during the incident and said that there was an absolute panic. 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm. A Soviet early warning satellite showed that the United States had launched 5 nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union, and the Soviet officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, had only minutes to decide whether or not the satellite data was a false alarm. After he saw that the satellite was properly working, according to the procedures, he should have reported an incoming attack, but he went with his gut instinct and didn't do so, since he believed that the United States was unlikely to fire only 5 missiles. He told his commanders that it was a false alarm before he had any evidence, thus saving the world. The false alarm was caused by the reflection of the sun on the tops of clouds. Able Archer 83. Able Archer 83 was a NATO military exercise that simulated a Soviet traditional attack on European NATO forces 3 days before the start of the exercise, chemical attacks 2 days before, and nuclear attacks 1 day before. These simulations included 170 radio-silent flights to airlift 19,000 U.S. troops to Europe, equipment that would have been used in a nuclear attack, the descent from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 1, and the participation from political leaders like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Helmut Kohl. This, combined with the use of encrypted diplomatic channels between the US and UK, made the Soviets think an actual nuclear attack was about to happen, so they fueled and armed their nuclear aircraft. Once they learned that this was just an exercise, Soviet leaders believed it to be an excuse to hide their real intent of a first nuclear strike. They frantically sent a telegram to its residencies seeking information on NATO preparations for an attack, and they believed that a NATO first strike would take 7 to 10 days to execute from the political decision being made. Luckily, they were cautious enough to not launch the missiles, and they stood down after the 11th of November when the exercise ended. The scariest thing is that NATO was unaware of the complete Soviet response at the time. Norwegian rocket incident. Russian President Boris Yeltsin became the first world leader to activate the Russian nuclear briefcase after Russian radar systems detected the launch of what was later determined to be a Norwegian Black Brant 12 research rocket being used to study the Northern Lights. Russian ballistic missile submarines were put on alert in preparation for a possible retaliatory strike. All of this happened even though Russia was one of the countries earlier informed of the launch, because the information had not reached the Russian radar operators.